Just like with fanny packs in fashion and slasher flicks in cinema, there are a ton of different fads and trends that have come and gone in the field of video games. A game will do something unique and interesting, and like clockwork, there'll be tons of copycats within the year trying to cash in on the new hype trend. So let's talk about one of them. One of the biggest trends from a little over a decade ago was the zombie craze. It seemed like you couldn't go more than a year in the late 2000s and early 2010s without a big game that was about the living dead. Dead Rising, Typing of the Dead, Dead Space, Left 4 Dead, Red Dead Redemption, Dead Island, The Walking Dead. The world just could not get enough of our flesh-eating friends. Zombies have been in video games for years, showing up in games like 1985's Ghosts and Goblins, 1986's Castlevania, and 1993's Zombies Ate My Neighbors. But it wouldn't be until the late 90s and early 2000s that zombies in video games would start surging in popularity, thanks to the huge success of games like Sega's 1996 light gun arcade game, The House of the Dead. In House of the Dead, like other light gun games, instead of using a proper gamepad, you use a plastic gun-shaped controller. These kinds of games were really popular in the 90s, probably because of the cool gun controllers. Playing shooters is just a lot more satisfying when it actually feels like you're holding a gun. Along with being in a popular genre, what made House of the Dead really cool was its sick-looking enemies and its creepy atmosphere. The series had several other games, but the most interesting one is definitely the spin-off, The Typing of the Dead. Are guns too boring for you? Well, how about killing zombies with a keyboard? The Typing of the Dead is a 1999 arcade game with keyboard controllers, where you have to type vocabulary words to defeat enemies. The funniest part is that your characters are actually using keyboards to fight enemies in the game, and they have Sega Dreamcast strapped to their backs. This game is scary, fun, and educational to boot. It's literally perfect. Another series that started in 1996 and helped to kickstart the zombie game explosion is Capcom's Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil is a game for the PlayStation that helped start the survival horror genre, a type of game where you as the player are put into stressful predicaments where you must manage resources and make smart decisions to survive terrifying situations. Resident Evil is part shooter and part puzzle game, where you must defeat zombies and other monsters as you try to explore a cryptic, spooky mansion, with all sorts of secrets and traps. Many people believe that both House of the Dead and Resident Evil helped bring zombies into mainstream popularity. One of those guys being George A. Romero, the guy who not only directed a commercial for Resident Evil 2, but also the 1968 film Night of the Living Dead. You know, the movie that basically created the idea of the modern flesh-eating zombie that we know and love today. A few years after Resident Evil and House of the Dead came out, we saw a surge in new zombie movies, from stuff like the fun romp Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, to the chaotically brutal 28 Days Later, to the less than stellar reviewed film adaptations of Resident Evil and House of the Dead, to the hilarious deadbeat zombie comedy Shaun of the Dead, to a remake of George A. Romero's 1978 pie-throwing zombie classic Dawn of the Dead. In a way, this created a feedback loop. The popularity of zombie games led to more zombie movies, which then led to more zombie games like Capcom's Resident Evil 4, which is not only a good zombie game, but the game also helped pioneer the third-person over-the-shoulder camera in video games. Capcom also dropped Dead Rising, a quirky time management game about trying to save survivors in a mall before they're scheduled to die. Thanks to games like these, zombies continued to stay in the public eye as we made our way into the late 2000s. But I think the year that zombies really hit their stride was 2008. This was the year we got the sci-fi horror classic developed by Visceral Games, Dead Space. We also got the hit co-op shooter developed by Valve, Left 4 Dead. But the one game that I think took zombies to unbelievable heights was, funnily enough, not even a zombie game. Treyarch's Call of Duty World at War. World at War is another World War II FPS Call of Duty game, but it has a special zombies mode which, like Left 4 Dead, allows a group of 4 players to fight hordes of the undead. The zombie mode was just a bonus survival mode, but it was immensely popular. Back in the day, I heard more people talk about this mode than the game's single-player campaign. After Call of Duty Zombies, we saw an explosion of zombie-related media, from movies like Zombieland and World War Z to Japanese anime like High School of the Dead and Sankarea, and of course games like Resident Evil 5, Plants vs. Zombies, Minecraft, Dead Rising 2, Lollipop Chainsaw, Zombie U, the list continues. The 3 games that released around the end of this time period that I think really served as a nice send-off to the golden age of zombie games are DayZ, The Last of Us, and Telltale's The Walking Dead. DayZ is a full game now, but back in 2012 and 2013, it was a mod created by Dean Hall for Bohemia Interactive's military shooter Arma 2. The DayZ mod turned Arma 2 into an open-world MMO survival shooter game, where you must survive in a zombie-infested world along with tons of other players. You could choose to help out your fellow man or kill them and take their supplies for yourself. The game was incredibly in-depth, with tons of features added in for the sake of realism, from simple stuff like needing food and water for survival to having to deal with getting sick from drinking unboiled water or potentially losing consciousness from a lack of blood. The mod was so popular that it began pushing sales for Arma 2, and eventually Dean Hall and Bohemia Interactive just released a standalone version of DayZ, which was in early access for years before it finally got a full version in late 2018. There were plenty of multiplayer zombie survival games before DayZ, but DayZ really captured that feeling of having to survive in a zombie apocalypse. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Telltale's The Walking Dead, an episodic choice-driven adventure game. Instead of being a very gameplay-heavy, system-driven game like DayZ, The Walking Dead is all about the story. In this game, you play as a convicted murderer named Lee Everett, who has to take care of a little girl named Clementine during a zombie apocalypse. Many times over the course of the game's story, you'll have to make tough choices that'll determine who takes a liking to you, what direction the story takes, and most importantly, who lives and who dies. One of the things that I think helped this game get so popular was the fact that it was released episodically. After Telltale released the first episode, they would release subsequent episodes a few months after the previous one. This helped the game build hype over time and establish a community of people anxiously waiting for the next episode, just like the Walking Dead TV show that was still going on at this time. And the fact that the game had a great story with well-written characters was obviously a plus. The Last of Us is also well known for its well-written characters. The Last of Us manages to get the best of both worlds, having interesting gameplay like DayZ and an engaging story like The Walking Dead. In this game, you play as Joel, a broken man who has to escort a girl named Ellie to a group called the Fireflies who are trying to save the world from the zombie threat. Now, technically, the enemies in this game aren't zombies, but I mean, come on, they might as well be zombies. One of the big things that a ton of people talked about leading up to this game was that the virus that infected people in this game was actually based on a real-world fungi called cordyceps. The zombies in this game look less like the undead and more like plant fungus creatures, which gave The Last of Us not only its own visual identity, but also a mechanical identity, as the infected in this game have multiple stages depending on how long they were infected, each one having different properties, which adds more variety to a relatively straightforward stealth-based cover shooter. So, you have to wonder, why were there so many zombie games, and why are so many of them still being made? Well, I mean, there has to be at least a few people that like deadheads for this genre to last as long as it has. But I think a more interesting question is, why do people love zombies? In terms of classic horror characters, I don't think zombies are nearly as scary as ghosts, vampires, or day-old pizza, but I think what makes zombies so scary is that they're inherently tied to the human experience. Things like Frankenstein monsters, werewolves, and aliens are just that, alien. They are these larger-than-life mythical creatures. Zombies, on the other hand, are humans like me and you, just dead. The fact that anyone can become a zombie by being bit by another zombie makes them seem just a bit more grounded. The fact that zombies are usually caused by a virus means there is a very clear element of germophobia at play as well, which a ton of people have picked up thanks to the recent 2020 pandemic. Anyone can become a zombie, meaning anyone and everyone is a potential threat. You've also got the uncanny valley aspect going on here. The fact that zombies seem like us but also unlike us is off-putting. Another thing that makes zombies so scary is a loss of self. Being bit by a zombie means you have to slowly feel yourself become an undead monster that could potentially kill the people you love. This is just my personal perspective, but one of my biggest fears is forgetting. Growing old and losing all of the precious memories that I have. If you lose the memories that made you who you are, then at that point, are you really yourself anymore? And I mean, one of the most obvious things that make zombies frightening is that they tend to slowly eat you alive, which sounds excruciatingly painful as opposed to, getting your noggin sliced off in one fell swoop by an axe maniac in a slasher movie. Zombies are pretty scary, and if there's one thing we've learned from the countless amount of YouTubers and Twitch streamers who have found enormous amounts of success screaming into cameras playing the latest new horror game, is that people love scary stuff. Horror is a genre that I think works better in video games than any other medium. In horror movies, books, and other forms of media, the main characters are the ones being chased by a guy with a machete wearing a potato sack. As a viewer, there's a disconnect there. However, in video games, you are the one being chased by the potato sack man. Well, at least a digital avatar of you. That disconnect is not as prevalent in games. Zombies aren't as big as they were back then, but there are still a healthy amount of zombie and zombie adjacent games still coming out to this day, like the Resident Evil 4 remake, Dying Light 2, Dead Island 2, the Callisto Protocol, The Last of Us Part 1, the Dead Space remake, Project Zomboid is still being updated to this day. The point is, the zombie trend is still going strong, and honestly, it's less of a trend now and more of a genre in and of itself that has solidified itself as a part of gaming culture.